those of you who saw the workshop earlier, thanks for attending. But for those of you who didn't, my name is Jason Skrzypek. I'm a field engineer at Solo. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cilium side of what Ron was just presenting, along with some of the configuration options that I think are going to be relevant internal to your organization. The TLDR of this presentation is that I want you to be well armed in your organization if you're getting any pushback from maybe your CISO team or your infrastructure team or your developer saying that this is too complicated, this is too hard, this isn't something I want to do, these features aren't available. Cilium can do it, and hopefully some of the material in the slides will convince you or give you that information. With that, network security is going to be a cross-cutting concern for development, operations, and compliance. So it's not one team that should be responsible for Cilium. There's going to be CRDs and resources that you create for the development side. There's going to be considerations to take for anything that's touching your infra down at the agent CNI level. And then compliance is going to want to know that Cilium project is doing everything it can to, well, be compliant for that matter. So I'll skim over some of the network policy because we did talk about that a little bit, both at the workshop and just a couple seconds ago. But there are a couple things that I do want to point out. On the left, you'll see the Kubernetes. This is kind of tabular data, and it's really difficult to read in white. I apologize for that. On the left, there's the things that are specific to Kubernetes network policy. On the right, there are the decisions that Cilium has made, and in the center are the things that they share. The one call out that I want to make is that Cilium, on top of network policy, gives you the ability with node selectors to do host level firewalls. I talked to those a little bit earlier in the workshop, but that's going to give you the ability to extend beyond the Kubernetes network into the host level network and provide a little bit more security outside of what you have, which is Kubernetes. There's also going to be down towards the bottom a bunch of matching on criteria. I did point out the differences. They're more semantic more than anything else. Because the endpoint option for Cilium, endpoint/entities, is going to just be a different approach to get to the same information that Kubernetes is providing. So as a developer, the blue gopher is going to represent the developer user story. You should be familiar or at least able to create a network policy because it's not something that's strictly infra related. You're going to know what applications what other services your application could communicate with better than the infra team or better than the CISO team. And so it'll help move the process along if you can start suggesting some of the network policy objects. The first question that usually comes up, though, if you're adopting Cilium, is how do I use these new formats? How do I change the spec? And to that, there is a publicly available editor.cilium.io. And I'll just bring that up to show you what that looks like. No, I will not. I'm not on the internet. We'll pretend I brought that up and it's on the screen right now. Basically, it's just a UI that gives you some options. I want to select pods from this namespace with these criteria. I want them to be able to communicate ingress, egress with these pods or these services or the external world. It'll generate the YAML file for you, and then you can copy that, put that in your repository, and then make that available to either your CI/CD system or whoever's responsible for pushing those changes. The second part, once you've actually gotten to the point where you know what network policy you want, you're going to also want to make sure that it's working as intended. And to that, inside each of the daemon sets, I probably should have made a mention here, you have the ability to run Cilium, the CLI, and monitor the types of policies and the verdicts of those policies. Here I have outlined some of the flags that you're going to want to focus on if you are implementing that in a more procedural way. The first one is that depending on whether or not you're letting Cilium touch layer 7 stuff, you can specify layer 7. You can also specify whether or not you want to just capture all of the drop traffic because maybe you're not seeing traffic that should be allowed, or vice versa, or all the accept traffic because something's happening that shouldn't be happening. And then lastly, you can filter based on endpoint IDs. We've talked about endpoints and the identification system there. This is just going to make it so that in a large multi-tenant cluster environment, you're able to pin down exactly what you want. And so at this point, you have a network policy. You're pretty comfortable that it is doing what it is. it's supposed to be doing, you can use that familiarity to actually go the opposite way. So let's say I have an application that I've been running for years, and it communicates with a bunch of different apps, but there have been many iterations, there have been many versions, and I'm just not certain what should talk to what. And from there is a way with policy audit mode in the daemon to determine what traffic normal behavior is. So to exercise your application and then pull those results and generate a network policy based off of that. I've got a simple 4-step policy process here because ultimately you don't want to have audit mode on in a production environment. This is something for a lower level. So this would be a simple 4-step process for that. With the developer concern, there are 2 more resources that are going to be relevant. There's the bandwidth manager. The bandwidth manager, you might ask, how does the amount of traffic leaving my pod impact security? But I would respond with the fact that we're already requiring that resources such as CPU and memory apply a good security posture. Network is just another resource in your pool. And so towards the end, I will say that that if you have a mutating webhook or a validating webhook that requires some sort of bandwidth management on your cluster, then you'll be better safeguarded against somebody spamming all the services in your cluster. Maybe you've got somebody who's maliciously entered your cluster and is just making it so you can't actually make use of the services there. I don't know of any one particular ransom Kubernetes situation right now offhand, but I imagine if it's not happened yet, it will. The way that this is enabled, I'm going a little bit backwards here. In the center column, there are 2 things that I want to mention here. This can be done with pod annotations. Basically, you specify, I want my application to only allow 10 megabits per second. You add that as an annotation per pod, and that allows you to, through the CNI, restrict traffic as it's leaving that pod. And then secondly, there's a more sophisticated method called, that's about congestion at your cluster level, and that's called BBR congestion control. That requires a lot more Cilium flags and a little bit more tailoring of your solution. So I would start with the annotations first, but do know that you have a more cluster-wide solution out there. The next part that I want to talk about, and this is probably going to touch upon more legacy feature sets, is that Cilium does come with an egress gateway, meaning that you can send all of the traffic that might be destined for outside of your cluster to a specific pod in your cluster, get it to be source netted, and then all of the systems that are listening for that specific egress IP can go through those systems already. At this point, it's a little bit late in the game for this to be too relevant. This would be more if you're just trying to migrate off of with a legacy firewall system and if you're not too familiar with Kubernetes, but it's nice to have this option out there. I know there are still situations where people need to make sure that traffic is going through a specific static setup, and this just facilitates that. We've talked about at least 3 times at this point about Cilium identity and endpoints, and the last thing that I want to just hit home there is, as I tried to illustrate with the diagram, is that it's unlike normal CNIs or previous CNIs, which do it all in one cohesive approach. The Cilium CNI is going to basically marry endpoints and identity, and there are going to be situations where that can become problematic. The situation that if I had access to my Cilium cluster, unfortunately I don't, would be to show you the IP cache table that is mapping the endpoints within the Cilium cluster. Okay, so switching down to putting our infra hats on, there is the option within Cilium to encrypt all the traffic. Right now, the leading providers are going to be IPsec and WireGuard, but there are a lot of caveats. If the screen's not too readable, I will go into a little bit more detail with these because there are some pretty big gotchas. With IPsec, I will point out that this is all reliant on what your infrastructure is already presenting. It's not something that comes bundled with CNI. It's something that you're going to have to implement and leverage from the kernel level, and then just make sure that the Cilium CNI is aware of that. And for that, the key management is going to be either manual deployment, which I wouldn't recommend, or Kubernetes secret deployment, which you could tie in something like Vault or whatever your secrets management solution is there. The second option, which is the more modern option, and I think probably what you run into first before you run into IPsec, is going to be WireGuard. WireGuard also uses the same method where it's going to assume kernel, but it does have the option to fall back into user space. As you can see there is a flag, enable WireGuard user space fallback, because not every host is going to be consistent. You might have, in the provisioning process, you might have missed that part, and that way it's not going to destroy your cluster's traffic. And then the last part, which is two last parts, are going to be that there is the option with WireGuard encryption or IPsec encryption. There's not necessarily a guarantee that traffic leaving the cluster is going to be encrypted. And for that, the best known approach is to make sure that you are putting the same scrutiny for your host configuration, for egress rules, as well as your Kubernetes internal rules. Because you will, assuming that your Kubernetes cluster is just a small part of your entire networking infrastructure, you're going to want to encrypt as much as possible. There's just going to be compliance reasons for that. And then on top, you can see, and this is going to be something that you'll find within the documentation, peppered here and there, is that never assume that a feature that's provided by Cilium is going to be fully compatible with strict kube-proxy replacement or partial kube-proxy replacement. There are going to be caveats. Make sure you read all the notes. And in this case, transparent encryption does not work with strict kube-proxy replacement. Moving on, a little bit more with the host configuration. For those, this is more of a introduction to the way that Cilium approaches the kube-proxy replacement. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the basically entry level, the least complicated way to deploy the CNI, the one that's going to change the least about your cluster, and that's CNI chaining, so that you can use it in conjunction with the pre-existing CNI. Your default, as you install the cluster, is going to be disabled replacement. And so that's going to use kube-proxy. You're going to have IP tables living alongside the functionality of eBPF. That's default for a reason. There's a lot of history with IP tables, and sometimes taking that out and swapping in something completely new leads to not good consequences. But as you get familiar with Cilium, you have the option to either do strict replacement or partial replacement. And I'll start with strict because that's basically a Boolean. You either say I want to be strict or I don't want to be strict. And there's one advanced option beyond that, but partial replacement is going to give you the spectrum. So you can decide I want the host services and I want the node port services of a strict replacement to go through the eBPF mechanisms, but I want to do everything else through kube-proxy. You can see some of the flags that are listed there. External IPs, socket load balancers, node ports, and host ports. You can choose some subset of those with partial replacement. And the last note I make is that with strict replacement, there's an additional flag that you can set that allows you to bypass net filter altogether. That I would say use with caution. It is going to require probably the most Helm install options of all of those that you can see here. But in a situation where you're trying to optimize everything down to the very smallest level, that's your best option. For anybody who is working in or related to government services, you're probably aware this probably gives you problems on the inside, is trying to be FIPS compliant. I didn't mention 142, 143. This is just a general overview of how to think of FIPS in relation to Cilium. And the long story short there is that Cilium itself is going to encompass four different sets of resources that all need to be FIPS compliant in order for it to be even considered a FIPS solution. And so generally speaking, it's not that you're saying Cilium is FIPS compliant. It's my Cilium configuration in conjunction with my IPsec or my WireGuard or with the Envoy process that's running in my cluster, that all together encrypt everything in a FIPS compliant method or FIPS compliant way with all of our proper modules. And then I broke those down. That's going to impact both user space and kernel space. User space being making sure your Kubernetes itself is FIPS enabled. Envoy, like I said, there is the process running in the cluster, and then whichever you choose between WireGuard and IPsec. I know that currently WireGuard doesn't have the ability to be FIPS compliant, but there are ways to configure, depending on your configuration. This isn't going to work for everybody, but there are ways to make IPsec FIPS compliant, depending on what technology you're actually using there to support it. And so drilling down into more of the compliance, this again is probably a little small, so I'll talk about the Spark notes here. But you're probably all aware that Kubernetes is an open source project. There's a lot of standards that have grown for security perspectives. The first one is that if you're going to run something in production, you probably should have scanned it for vulnerabilities before you put it out there, even if it's just to find what you're vulnerable to and not to necessarily remedy it immediately. And the two parts of that I want to mention about Cilium is that Cilium does, on the GitHub repo, have a security advisory section that tells you what the known CVEs at that point in time are, but they do not post any of the specific scanning tool solutions out there. I just to inform myself for this session, did scan the Cilium daemon set pod, and as of version 12.3, it only has 2 medium and 18 low. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. The second part, well, I guess we'll talk about it right now, is to reduce the attack surface with minimal dependencies using images that might be Scratch if possible, or images that have less dependencies, so that you're not, as Christian said, randomly pulling in Java libraries that do magical and disastrous things. So in regards to that, the Cilium images are built with multi-stage builds, so that means you're not carrying over all of the build dependencies into your finished product. The Cilium agent does have Ubuntu 22.04 as a base, but as you can see, based on my results of the scan, it is still low severity footprint. The Cilium operator, which is the controller that's running to make sure that all of the CRDs be converted and that all the endpoints in the IPAM works, that itself is based on Scratch. You don't even have a shell access to it, so that one's real lockdown. And the last thing, this is something you'll hear probably about a dozen times before you leave KubeCon this week, is signature verifications and SBOMs. I know it was a big thing last year. There currently is an SBOM generation, and there are currently no signatures on the Cilium images, but both of these are a work in progress. There's a CNCF program where you can do more of like a first issue sort of submission to an open source project, and both of those are targeted for that. I don't know what the current, this is work in progress was as of last week. I assume it hasn't happened in the last week, but it should be pretty shortly that that's generated, because there's enough tooling out there in the ecosystem right now that that's not too difficult to do. I think I have 2 more slides. Also with compliance, going back to when I said resources, it's good security posture to make sure that those are minimal. In the installation for the Cilium values file, you can see a bunch of proper defaults. So the first one is that they provide resource limits and requests. So in production, I would suggest uncommenting those and putting meaningful values for you, but they do provide some basics based on their knowledge. And then Cilium also, for high scale environments, does provide commented quotas for all of its resources. So making sure that you're not killing your system with operator pods, or make sure you're not killing your system with daemon sets. I think the limit for daemon sets is 5,000 or something. So it's more on the higher end of the scale, but it is good to know that they've considered that in the deployment. I'm sure most of us have heard that it's not great to run as root in a pod. There is the ability to run, and I've tested this a bunch of times, in the agent in rootless mode, but currently the operator does require root, but that being less of a concern because we are running in a Scratch environment. So root access, we don't have shell. There's going to be a less of an attack surface there. And then lastly, We wanted to make sure in any deployment that you have proper scoping. This workload can do this in this environment, can't do anything else. I've come through all of the RBAC. The RBAC seems properly scoped. There's not any resource in there that isn't actually being leveraged by the product by some feature set. I will say with a caveat there that if you're going to run Cilium in production, you might, depending on the features that you ultimately use, pare that down to a different set of RBAC rules. But what they have by default is a good start. And so I guess in summation, I hope Cilium is powerful. eBPF allows you to do a lot of things that standard IP tables or even IPVS couldn't allow you to do. There is the potential for some good scaling and optimization there. But on the back end of that, it is very complex. Like I had mentioned, there are lots of options that are readily available through the Helm chart install or through the configuration, whichever installation method you use. But those not all of them, but a lot of those have implications as to dropping other features or making it so that other things are incompatible. So definitely validate your installation and do some level of quality assurance so that you're validating that if I enable WireGuard, that I'm still properly exposing on the right hosts, or I still have access to host services or host ports. But the long story short is that Cilium is in fact a secure product, or it can be a secure product. As long as you go into deploying Cilium with a critical mindset and you don't overlook a lot of the installation components and what's running under the hood, there's a way to make the developers, the operators, and the compliance people all happy, and just make sure your environment's well secured. And as I ended my workshop with earlier, if you're interested in deploying Cilium, some of you might already be running Cilium because it is becoming something of a de facto standard in cloud environments. You can see that GCP, AWS, Civo, DigitalOcean, they all provide Cilium options. Otherwise, feel free to try deploying Cilium in your own local environments with your own local distribution. With that said, I know I went a little bit over. I think I still have a couple minutes for questions if anybody's.